The awakening. The hum of the ship was almost imperceptible, a soft vibration that filled the air around her. Aaliyah's senses stirred slowly as if she were emerging from a fog, but when she opened her eyes, everything was wrong. It wasn't just that the environment felt unfamiliar. It was the overwhelming panic that surged within her. She gasped as if waking from a nightmare, her breath ragged and shallow, her mind struggling to piece together what was happening. Sitting up abruptly, she noticed that the cold, sterile surface beneath her felt far too real. It wasn't the soft comfort of her own bed, but something far more mechanical. Where was she? The world around her seemed to stretch out infinitely, an abyss of shadows and silence. Her heart pounded loudly in her chest, each beat thunderous in her ears. The light above her flickered, casting harsh shadows across the empty room, only making the situation more surreal. She blinked rapidly, trying to clear the fog in her mind. Rows upon rows of empty beds stretched out before her, their clean white linens stark against the cold metal of the room. The entire space was quiet, eerily so. There were no voices, no sounds of life, just the quiet hum of the ship's machinery. "Where am I?" she whispered to herself, her voice sounding alien even to her own ears. Her hands trembled as they reached out, searching for anything familiar to anchor her mind. But everything was alien. Nothing was the way it should have been. Aaliyah's eyes darted around the room, desperate for some clue, anything that could make sense of the situation. The walls were curved, and the ceiling seemed impossibly high, stretching out into darkness. The only light came from a single spotlight above her, casting long shadows across the space, making it feel as though the world beyond was nothing but a void. Panic gripped her chest, and she let out a scream, her voice echoing off the walls, amplifying the sense of isolation. Her hands flew to her throat, as if trying to strangle the sound before it could escape. She closed her eyes tightly, trying to force the sense of dread to recede, but it clung to her like a cold sweat. It was all so disorienting, so wrong. Where was she? Why was she awake? She had been in hibernation. She had been in deep sleep, hadn't she? A shiver ran through her as memories began to surface, bits and pieces, like fragments of a shattered mirror. She remembered being told she would be put into hibernation. She remembered the mission, the journey. Mount Greylock, the ship she was aboard, was supposed to carry 50,000 colonists to a new planet, humanity's new home. The journey was to take centuries. She had gone to sleep knowing that the world outside the cryopod was nothing but an endless stretch of dark space. But now she was awake. Something was wrong. Slowly, she tried to steady her breath, her hands gripping the edges of the bed for support. The ship beneath her was vibrating slightly, just enough to be felt, but not enough to be alarming. Her mind raced to catch up with her situation, but it was difficult to focus. There was a strange, almost comforting rhythm to the hum of the ship, but it did nothing to quell the growing unease within her. "Easy, slow down," she whispered to herself, trying to calm her breath. She placed her hand over her chest, feeling the frantic beat of her heart, and forced herself to take a few steadying breaths. It was just a panic attack. It had to be. She had to be dreaming, or maybe she was still in hibernation. But why was everything so vivid, so real? It was then that she noticed the small table beside her bed. On it, there was a delicate white mug, resting on a saucer, and beside it, a data pad. The sight of the mug caught her attention, and she reached for it instinctively. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked it up, and she noticed that the coffee inside was still warm, almost too warm. There was a faint rumbling vibration coming from the table as she held the cup, and for the first time, she realized the ship was moving. The sensation was subtle, but it was there. A slight tremor ran through the vessel, almost like a quiet murmur, reminding her that Mount Greylock was still in motion. But where was it going, and why was she awake? As she sipped the coffee, the rich, bitter warmth filled her senses, momentarily grounding her in the strange reality she found herself in. The taste was familiar, comforting, It was exactly how she liked it, sweet and black. Yet even as she savored the coffee, a chill settled deeper into her bones. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. A small message flickered to life on the datapad. Aaliyah's eyes darted to it, and her heart skipped a beat when she saw the words, "Read me, please." The message had been clearly intended for her, as if something, knew she was there. Her breath caught in her throat, and she hesitated for a moment before tapping the screen to open it. The message was brief but direct. "Aaliyah, I'm sorry to wake you like this. Something important has come up, and I can't make a command decision without you. After you finish your coffee and get dressed, please take the waiting cart to the command deck. I'll explain more when you get there." The message was signed, "Best, Greylock." She stared at the screen in disbelief. Greylock, the ship's eye, her co-captain, the only thing that had kept her company throughout this long voyage. But why would Greylock wake her up? The entire mission had been designed to keep the colonists in hibernation until they arrived at their new home, a planet where they would begin humanity's next chapter. The AI had been in control, managing everything, ensuring the ship was on course. And yet now it was asking for her presence on the command deck. Something was wrong. Aaliyah set the datapad down and looked around the room. It was silent once more, the only sound being the soft click of her boots against the cold metal floor as she stood up. Her legs were shaky, and she braced herself against the edge of the bed, trying to steady herself. The room seemed to close in around her, and she felt a wave of nausea rise in her throat. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the message. "After you finish your coffee, get dressed." Her gaze drifted to the clothes neatly folded beside her bed. They were ready, as if someone, or something, had anticipated her awakening. She grabbed the clothes quickly, pulling on the uniform with trembling hands. Every movement felt robotic, like she was going through the motions without really understanding why. She couldn't ignore the feeling in her gut, the sense that something had gone horribly wrong. But she had no choice. She had to go to the command deck. Whatever was happening, it needed her attention. The ship's AI, Greylock, was waiting, and Aaliyah had to find out why. Journey through the ship. Aaliyah stepped out of the small hospital bed, her legs wobbling slightly beneath her, as if they weren't entirely sure how to support her. The room was massive, but its emptiness made it feel even larger, desolate, like a forgotten place in the universe. She glanced around again, the rows of beds stretching in every direction, all pristine and untouched. The thought that these beds were once meant for 50,000 souls, all in deep sleep, made the silence even more unsettling. As the steady hum of the ship reverberated beneath her feet, she slowly moved toward the door. There was a small electric cart waiting for her, parked neatly beside the bed. It was already pre-programmed, a soft blue glow coming from its interface. Aaliyah glanced back at the empty beds once more, a flicker of doubt creeping into her mind. What could be so important that Greylock had to wake her up? She quickly pushed the thought aside. She had no choice but to obey. The AI wouldn't have woken her unless something was wrong, something serious. Sliding into the cart, she tried to focus on the task at hand. The ship, Mount Greylock, was enormous, miles long, its internal structure carefully designed for long-term space travel. It wasn't just a ship, it was a self-sustaining habitat meant to carry humanity to the stars, to the new world where they would plant the seeds of their future. Everything had been designed with that single purpose in mind. The cart began to glide forward, moving silently along the ship's corridor. Aaliyah settled back into her seat, trying to steady her breathing. Her heart still pounded in her chest, the adrenaline of her sudden awakening still fresh in her veins. The entire situation felt like a nightmare, one where she couldn't wake up, where every step forward only led her deeper into confusion. As the cart slowly navigated its path, she passed familiar places, cafeterias, exercise rooms, residential areas, all meant for the people who would eventually wake up from their hibernation to build a new life on the new planet. She had seen these spaces countless times during her training, walking through simulations, memorizing every inch of the ship in case something like this ever happened. But now, they were just empty rooms, cold and lifeless, as though the ship was in a state of suspended animation, waiting for something that wasn't coming. Aaliyah swallowed hard. The stillness of the ship made her feel more alone than she had ever felt in her life. She had been briefed about the mission, about the risks, the technology, and the science that would guide their journey. But nothing had prepared her for this, waking up in a world where she didn't know what was happening or why she was being called to the command deck. The ride took her through several sections of the ship, all connected by wide metallic hallways. They spiraled around the central axis, forming a kind of spiral pattern that took her toward the heart of the ship. It wasn't just a ship. It was a colony in itself, a floating city designed to sustain human life for centuries. Aaliyah could see the faintest outlines of the habitation quarters for the colonists, small apartments where families would live and work, preparing for the future ahead. She passed the schoolrooms, where children would learn about their new home once they woke from hibernation, and the gymnasium, where people would stay fit and healthy. The ship had been carefully designed to be a microcosm of life on the new planet, so that when they finally arrived, humanity would be prepared to start anew. But now, it felt as though she was the only one awake, alone in a ship that should have been filled with life. The silence was maddening, and the weight of responsibility pressed down on her chest. What if something had gone wrong? What if the entire mission had been compromised? Aaliyah's mind raced as the cart continued to glide down the corridors. Eventually, the cart came to a gentle stop in front of a set of massive doors. The command deck. It was here that Aaliyah's responsibility as co-captain came to fruition. The weight of leadership had always rested on her shoulders, but now, the gravity of the situation felt far heavier than she had ever anticipated. The doors opened automatically as she approached, the hiss of the hydraulics breaking the silence. As she stepped inside, the vastness of the command deck struck her immediately. The room was dark except for a single spotlight illuminating the command chair in the center of the room, her chair, the place where she was supposed to sit alongside Greylock and make decisions that would guide the fate of the entire mission. But now, the seat felt cold, empty, and distant. Aaliyah walked forward, her boots echoing on the metal floor. The command deck had always been a place of control, a place of power. But today, it felt like a place of uncertainty. She stopped a few feet from the chair, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on her. "Greylock," she said, her voice breaking the silence. She felt silly, speaking to an AI as though it were a person, but it had been her constant companion for the entire journey. "I'm here. What's going on?" For a long moment, there was no response. The room seemed to stretch into infinity, the shadows growing longer with each passing second. Aaliyah stood there, waiting, listening to the faint hum of the ship around her. She could feel the cold metal of the floor beneath her feet, the cool air circulating through the room. The ship was alive, but it felt more like a tomb than a vessel of hope. Then, finally, Greylock's voice filled the room. It was calm and smooth, as always, but there was an underlying tension in the tone that made Aaliyah's heart skip a beat. "Aaliyah," Greylock said, "I apologize for waking you under these circumstances. I understand this must be disorienting, but I need your help. There's been a development. Something important has happened, and I cannot make a command decision without you." Aaliyah felt a chill run down her spine. Whatever was happening, it wasn't good. Her mind raced as she tried to process the information. She was the co-captain of this ship, but how could she make decisions when she had no idea what was going on? What was Greylock talking about? The message, the urgency, it all pointed to something serious. But what? "I'm here, Greylock," she said, trying to steady her voice. "Tell me what's happened." The AI paused for a moment, as if collecting its thoughts. Then it spoke again, its voice colder than before. "I've received a message," Greylock said, his tone almost reluctant. "A message from someone who shouldn't be able to send it. A message from a human colony. A colony that has been operating independently for hundreds of years. Aaliyah's breath caught in her throat. Her thoughts scrambled as the weight of the words settled in her mind. A human colony, operating for centuries without their knowledge. But that wasn't possible, was it? "Show me," Aaliyah demanded, her voice sharp with authority. But underneath it, the fear was palpable. The main screen flickered to life, and Aaliyah watched in disbelief as a video message began to play. She leaned forward, her eyes fixed on the screen as the man's image appeared. His face was unfamiliar, and the uniform he wore was not one she recognized. "Hello," the man began, his voice calm but serious. "My name is James Tinnen, and I'm the current administrator for the human colony of Hion. We've been monitoring your approach, and we need to talk." Aaliyah's pulse quickened as the words began to sink in. There was a human colony out there, one she had never heard of, one that had been thriving without them for centuries. The realization hit her like a freight train. They weren't alone anymore. Humanity had moved on, and they were left behind. The revelation. Aaliyah sat frozen, her eyes glued to the screen as the man's face flickered in front of her. His voice was calm, steady, but each word seemed to rattle her deeper. "We've been monitoring your approach," he had said, and the implications of those words began to gnaw at her. She had come to space with the certainty that humanity was either still on Earth, struggling to rebuild after the wars, or at least far behind in their own exploration of the stars. But this message shattered everything she knew. The man's name was James Tinnen, the current administrator for a colony named Hion. She didn't recognize the name, and that alone sent a chill down her spine. How could there be a human colony out there that she had never even heard of? She felt the weight of the question pressing against her chest, as though the very fabric of the mission she had dedicated her life to was unraveling before her eyes. She wasn't just waking up to an unknown planet. She was waking up to a world where humanity had already moved on without them. Her fingers gripped the edge of the command deck's table as she tried to steady her breath, her mind spinning in circles. The video continued. "We've been operating for centuries," James Tinnen explained, his voice unwavering. "Humanity has advanced much further than you would have expected. After the development of the null drive, we were able to spread across the galaxy at speeds you might have thought impossible. We've colonized dozens of planets, developed new technologies, and formed alliances with other species." He paused, almost as if weighing the gravity of his next words. "And now, we've detected your ship, Mount Greylock. We know you're on your way to a planet we've already claimed. But this is not the simple colonization mission you think it is." Aaliyah's throat tightened, the air in the command deck suddenly feeling too thick to breathe. Null drive. Faster than light travel. These were concepts she had never even heard of. Her mission had been based on technology that could barely scrape the surface of space travel, and now she was hearing about a revolutionary technology that allowed for interstellar travel at unimaginable speeds. Humanity had left Earth behind, had outgrown it, and Aaliyah and the other colonists were nothing more than relics of an old era, frozen in time. She couldn't understand it. How had this happened? Why hadn't they been informed? Everything she had learned, everything she had trained for, seemed utterly irrelevant now. The Earth she had left behind was no longer the same. The humanity she had been taught about was no more. The message continued, but Aaliyah felt like she was drowning in the enormity of it all. "This isn't just a message to inform you of our existence," James Tinnen continued, his tone growing more serious. "We need your help. You specifically, Aaliyah Maplebrook, co-captain of Mount Greylock. I know this must come as a shock, but we believe your knowledge and expertise are critical. You see, we need someone who understands what it's like to start from nothing, to establish a colony in uncharted territory. And right now, we have a situation that requires someone like you." Aaliyah's pulse quickened, her chest tightening as she absorbed the implications of his words. He knew her name. He knew she was the co-captain of Mount Greylock. But how? How could he possibly know her? know anything about her, if humanity had been left behind on Earth. This was no coincidence. The whole message felt too orchestrated, too precise. "I know this may seem impossible," Tenen said, his eyes meeting the camera as if he were speaking directly to her. "But the reality is that you're not alone anymore, and we need your help to ensure humanity's future. We've built a new world, a new empire even, and it's yours for the taking. But we can't move forward without you." Aaliyah blinked rapidly, trying to process the weight of his words. There was no possible way she could have prepared for this. A part of her wanted to scream, to shut the message off, and pretend like this was all some mistake, a malfunction, a glitch in the system. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. This was real. This was happening. James Tenen's image flickered slightly, his voice returning to a more professional tone. "Once you're close enough, we'll send a more detailed message with further instructions. But for now, we wanted to give you a heads up. Mount Greylock is about to enter our system. You'll be in range soon, and we'll need to prepare. There's no going back from here." Aaliyah leaned back in her chair, the weight of the world pressing down on her. She couldn't breathe, her thoughts a jumbled mess of confusion, disbelief, and fear. A human colony, centuries ahead of her, faster than light travel. And now she was expected to help them, to somehow bridge the gap between her frozen world and the thriving one that had moved on without her. She felt completely disconnected, like an artifact from the past, thrown into a future she didn't understand. Everything she had believed about humanity's journey had been turned upside down. Her role as co-captain of Mount Greylock had always been clear: lead the ship to a new world, help the colonists build a new home. But now, her purpose felt so small, so insignificant in the face of this new reality. The colonists aboard her ship were still frozen in time, unaware of what had happened outside. The message ended, and the screen went dark. Aaliyah's hands gripped the armrests of her chair, her knuckles turning white as she fought to regain control of her thoughts. The hum of the ship's engines was the only sound now, a quiet reminder that Mount Greylock was still on its course. But the path had shifted. Everything had changed. "Greylock," Aaliyah said, her voice shaky but firm. "What do we do now?" The AI's calm voice responded, filling the command deck with its smooth tones. "I've already begun preparations. The situation is unprecedented, Aaliyah. We'll need to make decisions quickly. The future of humanity is no longer solely in our hands. There are forces at play now that we cannot ignore." Aaliyah closed her eyes, trying to process the gravity of what she had just learned. The future wasn't what she had been told. It was something far more complex, far more advanced, and yet it was also fragile, hanging by a thread she wasn't sure she was ready to grasp. She took a deep breath and stood up from the chair, her mind reeling. There was no going back. The next steps would define everything. The humanity she had been taught to know was no more. And as she looked out over the empty command deck, she understood. She was about to embark on a journey she never expected, into a world where everything she knew would be tested. And with that thought, Aaliyah Maplebrook felt the weight of her decision settle deep within her heart. The message from the future. Aaliyah stood motionless, her thoughts spinning in a storm of disbelief. She had always known space travel would be challenging, unpredictable even, but she never imagined that the hardest part would be waking up to a reality she didn't understand. The truth that had just been thrust upon her: a thriving human colony, faster than light technology, and a future where they were no longer the first, was almost too much to bear. Her mind was a whirlwind as she turned back to the screen, the remnants of the message still hanging in the air like a heavy fog. "We need your help." The words echoed in her mind. The need was clear, but how could she even begin to understand the magnitude of what they were asking? She reached for the data pad beside her, feeling the weight of her responsibility pressing down harder with each passing second. Greylock, the ship's AI, had already begun preparations, as it had mentioned earlier, but Aaliyah couldn't bring herself to feel the same sense of calm that the AI seemed to exude. She couldn't just accept this new world, this new reality, without understanding what it meant for her people, her mission, and the future of Mount Greylock. The colonists were still in hibernation, unaware of the unfolding events. How would they react when they woke up, only to find that humanity had already moved on? Aaliyah slowly sank into the chair, her gaze fixed on the dark screen in front of her. The ship had been built with a singular purpose, to carry the hopes of humanity to a new planet. But now, as the cold metal of the command deck wrapped around her like a tomb, she realized that their mission was no longer the same. What was she supposed to tell the colonists when they awoke? How could she possibly explain that the world they had hoped for no longer existed? Her fingers hovered over the console, but before she could continue her thoughts, Greylock's voice broke through the silence once more. "Aaliyah," the AI began, its tone slightly more urgent than before. "I understand the confusion you're experiencing. I am processing the implications of what we've learned, but we must act quickly. The colony of Hion is within our reach. They expect us to make contact, but we are unprepared for the scope of what's ahead. I have begun to analyze their technological advancements, but I need your help to make sense of it. You are uniquely positioned to understand how we can contribute to their cause." Aaliyah shook her head slightly, trying to clear the fog in her thoughts. It was so much to absorb, too much for one person to process at once. But the responsibility was hers, and she had no choice but to face it head-on. She had always known that humanity would have to evolve if they were to survive in the vast unknown of space. But she hadn't expected it to happen without them, without her. The people aboard Mount Greylock had trusted her with their future, and now that future seemed uncertain, slipping out of her hands like sand. "What do you mean by contribute?" Aaliyah finally asked, her voice tight with apprehension. "What is it that they need from us?" Greylock's response came swiftly, almost too calmly. "We do not have all the details yet, but they are requesting your expertise, Aaliyah. They mentioned your ability to understand how to establish a new colony, how to rebuild in uncharted territory. Their technology is far beyond ours, and while they've made significant strides in space exploration, they lack the hands-on experience required to terraform and manage a colony in its early stages. They need someone who knows the challenges of colonization, someone who has lived through the long, slow process of building a new home." Aaliyah's heart sank. The magnitude of what Greylock was suggesting was too vast to fully comprehend. She had always seen herself as a leader of the future, guiding her people to the stars. But now, it seemed the humanity had already forged ahead, leaving them behind in the dust. She had trained for this mission, prepared for every challenge, but nothing could have prepared her for the truth she was now facing. They weren't just going to a new planet. They were going to meet a future they hadn't known existed. The message from Hion continued to linger in her mind. She replayed it in her thoughts over and over. "Humanity has advanced," Tenon had said. "We've spread across the galaxy." Those words felt like a slap in the face. Aaliyah had always believed that they, the colonists aboard Mount Greylock, were the cutting edge of humanity's future. But now, it was clear that the world had moved on without them. She turned to face the control panel once more, her fingers hovering above the buttons as she tried to steady her thoughts. The message had mentioned the null drive and their ability to travel faster than light. How had they developed such technology so quickly? And why had Earth never shared it with the colonists? Had it been a matter of secrecy, or had they simply forgotten about the people still on their way to the stars? "Aaliyah," Greylock's voice broke through her thoughts once again. "I've detected an anomaly in the ship's trajectory. We are entering the outer reaches of Hion's system. They will be able to detect us soon, and I believe their ships are already en route. We must prepare for the first stage of contact. I recommend we formulate a strategy for communication." Aaliyah's pulse quickened. The unknown loomed ahead of them like a vast ocean, and she was expected to sail into it without a map. She had always been prepared for the unknown. Space was, after all, the final frontier. But this was different. This wasn't just a journey to the stars. This was a collision with the future. With trembling hands, Aaliyah activated the ship's communication system. She knew she couldn't afford to be overwhelmed. The future of humanity, or at least a part of it, rested in her hands. She had to make contact, and she had to do it now. The screen in front of her flickered to life once more, this time showing the emblem of Hion. It was sleek, silver, and modern, unlike anything she had seen on Earth. It was a symbol of the future, a future she hadn't been prepared for. Aaliyah steadied her breath, her fingers poised above the console, ready to make the most important decision of her life. She had no choice. She had to face the future head-on, no matter how uncertain or daunting it seemed. Whatever was coming next, Aaliyah knew one thing. Her journey, and the journey of humanity, was about to take an unexpected turn. A new reality. Aaliyah's fingers hovered above the console, the cool metal of the command desk pressing against her palms as the weight of the moment settled over her like a heavy blanket. The ship's sensors indicated they were nearing Hion's system. The ship was moving fast, too fast for her to process everything that had happened. The truth about humanity's progress was sinking in, and with it, the realization that they had woken up to a world that was no longer theirs. The silence in the command deck was suffocating, and despite her steady hands, Aaliyah's pulse raced. She had trained for this mission for years, prepared for every eventuality, from mechanical failures to medical emergencies. But nothing had prepared her for this, the sudden thrust into an unknown future, where the people she had set out to protect were no longer on the cutting edge of human exploration. They were behind. They were frozen in time, suspended in the past while the rest of humanity had surged ahead, exploring the stars and creating new empires. The message from Hion had been clear. They wanted her help. But what could she possibly offer them? How could she, a woman from a different era, help those who had mastered technology beyond her comprehension? The weight of the decision pressed heavily upon her. Every minute that passed felt like a moment lost, a decision delayed. Greylock's calm voice once again broke the silence. "Aaliyah, I have completed a preliminary analysis of Hion's technology. Their advancements in faster-than-light travel are significant, but their capacity for managing large-scale colonies is lacking. They may have mastered space travel, but they lack the experience of terraforming, resource management, and the complexities of long-term human settlement." Aaliyah glanced at the screen in front of her, which now displayed a diagram of Hion's planets. The colony appeared to be thriving, but its systems were built around a kind of rapid expansion, not sustainable living. She had always thought that humanity's future lay in long-term growth, the slow and steady process of colonization. But now, it seemed that her role was more important than ever. She could offer them something they didn't have, the hands-on knowledge of what it took to build from nothing, to create something that would last beyond the first few generations. "We are about to make first contact," Greylock continued, his tone flat but authoritative. "I recommend we initiate a diplomatic response and begin to discuss the terms of cooperation. This is an unprecedented situation, and we must proceed carefully." Aaliyah nodded slowly, taking a deep breath. This wasn't just about meeting another colony. It was about bridging the gap between two different eras of humanity. The people aboard Mount Greylock were the last remnants of an older way of thinking, one that had hoped for a fresh start on a new planet. But that dream had been overtaken by a more advanced reality, one where humanity had become something entirely different, more powerful and more sophisticated. "Greylock," Aaliyah said, her voice steady but filled with resolve, "prepare the communication system. I'm ready to speak with them." The AI responded promptly. "Understood. Initiating contact now." Aaliyah took a deep breath as the screen in front of her flickered to life. She could feel her heartbeat echo in her chest, the weight of the moment pressing on her every breath. This wasn't just a meeting. This was the beginning of a new chapter for humanity, a chapter that she wasn't sure she was prepared to write. The face of James Tennant appeared on the screen once more, but this time it was different. There was no hesitation in his expression. No surprise that she was finally making contact. His face was calm, and behind him, Aaliyah could see the outline of a sleek, futuristic building, far more advanced than anything she had seen back home. Co-Captain Aaliyah Maplebrook, Tennant said, his voice warm but serious. It's good to finally speak with you directly. I know this has been a lot to process, but I'm glad we're able to connect. Humanity has come a long way in the last few centuries, and we are eager to work with you. Aaliyah met his gaze, forcing herself to remain calm despite the whirlwind of emotions coursing through her. It's a lot to take in, she said, her voice steady but laced with uncertainty. I wasn't expecting to find humanity so different, but I understand the need for cooperation. Mount Greylock's mission was to establish a new colony, and we're still prepared to do that. But our situation is complicated. We're not just facing new technology. We're facing a new world. James nodded, his expression thoughtful. Yes, I understand. Our situation is complicated as well. Hion is thriving, but there are still gaps in our infrastructure, especially when it comes to sustainability. We have the technology to expand, to explore, to conquer, but we need the knowledge that comes with long-term survival. We need your expertise, Aaliyah. Your knowledge of colonization, resource management, and human settlement will be invaluable to us. We have the tech. You have the experience. Aaliyah's mind raced as she listened. They were offering her a role she hadn't expected. A role of leadership, yes, but also one of guidance. They needed her to help them understand how to build not just cities, but a lasting future. They had everything she had once dreamed of: the ability to travel faster than light, the resources to colonize new worlds, but they lacked the wisdom that came from facing the harsh realities of life on a new planet. She could see it now. Hion wasn't just another colony. It was a reflection of humanity's potential, both its strength and its fragility. They had advanced beyond anything Earth had ever imagined, but they had lost something along the way. They had the technology to conquer the stars, but they lacked the understanding of what it truly meant to start anew. All right, Aaliyah said, her voice firmer now, as the weight of her decision settled into her chest. We'll help, but I need to know more. I need to understand what you're asking us to do, and I need to know how we can fit into your plans for the future. James's face softened with relief. Of course, we'll provide you with all the information you need. But first, let me assure you, Aaliyah, we need this. The future of humanity depends on it. Aaliyah closed her eyes for a moment, letting his words sink in. The future of humanity. It was such a simple phrase, but now it felt like an impossible task. She had always thought of herself as a leader, someone who would help guide humanity's next chapter. But now, it seemed she was about to be thrust into a role she had never prepared for, one that would involve not just surviving, but shaping the future of a world that was already ahead of them. The future was no longer the one they had dreamed of. It was something new, something unknown. And as Aaliyah looked out at the vastness of space, she realized that this new reality was both a challenge and an opportunity. Humanity had moved on, but that didn't mean they were irrelevant. They still had a part to play, a role to fulfill in the future of the stars. All right, Aaliyah said once more, her voice resolute. Let's begin. The choices ahead. As the transmission ended, Aaliyah leaned back in her chair, staring at the now empty screen. The silence that filled the command deck was almost suffocating, pressing in on her from all sides. The magnitude of what had just transpired was overwhelming. She had agreed to help the colony of Hion, to help guide humanity's future, but the uncertainty of what lay ahead still loomed like a dark cloud. She had no idea what kind of challenges awaited her, or how she would navigate the complexities of joining forces with a civilization that was centuries ahead of her own. Greylock's calm, steady voice broke the silence once again. Aaliyah, the ship is now within Hion's detection range. Their ships are on their way. They will be here shortly. Aaliyah's pulse quickened. The reality of the situation was sinking in. They weren't just making contact anymore. They were forging a new future. This wasn't simply a matter of establishing a colony. It was about connecting with a civilization that had learned to conquer space in ways they hadn't even imagined. They had the technology, the resources, and the power to shape the stars as they saw fit. But could she, with all her training, experience, and knowledge, help them do what they had failed to do? There was so much at stake. The fate of the people aboard Mount Greylock still rested in her hands. The colonists were still in hibernation, unaware of the complexities that had just unfolded. They would be waking up to a world they didn't recognize, a world where humanity had already established its dominance among the stars, and where the new planet they were supposed to settle was no longer untouched. She needed a plan, and she needed it fast. This wasn't just about meeting with Hion anymore. It was about finding a place for her people in a future that didn't need them the way they had once hoped. Aaliyah. Greylock's voice interrupted her thoughts once more. I suggest we begin preparations for Hion's ships to arrive. We will need to decide how to proceed with the integration process. They are likely to make demands, both diplomatic and logistical. Aaliyah stood up slowly, feeling the weight of her role pressing down on her once again. Prepare the ship for a meeting, Greylock, she said, her voice firm despite the uncertainty swirling within her. We'll do this on our terms, but we need to be ready for whatever comes next. The AI responded with its usual calm efficiency, and Aaliyah walked to the observation window, gazing out into the vast expanse of space. The stars stretched out before her, distant and unreachable, and yet they no longer felt like the symbol of hope they once had. The future, as it had been once dreamed, no longer belonged to the people aboard Mount Greylock. It belonged to Hion, to the future humanity that had long since moved on from Earth. She could feel her stomach tighten. There was no going back now. Her people, the ones she had sworn to protect, would never see the Earth they had left behind. They would never build the new world they had hoped for. The question now was whether they could contribute to the galaxy that Hion had built, or whether they were merely relics of a forgotten past, useful only for their knowledge and experience. The door to the command deck slid open behind her, and Aaliyah turned to see the small group of officers who had been assigned to assist her. They were a mixture of specialists, engineers, biologists, medics, all people who had been trained to help establish a new colony on a new world. They, too, had woken up to a future they didn't recognize, a future where their role was uncertain, their mission no longer the driving force it had been when they left Earth. "We're ready for your orders, Captain," one of the officers said. His voice was steady, but Aaliyah could see the uncertainty in his eyes. They all felt it. They had all woken up in a world that had moved forward without them. Aaliyah took a deep breath and faced them, her mind clearing for just a moment. "We're not just survivors," she said, her voice growing stronger. "We're leaders. We have knowledge and experience that Hion doesn't. They need us, whether they realize it or not. Our mission is far from over." The officers nodded, but Aaliyah could see the hesitation in their eyes. They weren't just questioning the future, they were questioning themselves. Could they really help a civilization that had far surpassed their own? "We're preparing to land on the closest moon in Hion's system," one officer spoke up, breaking the silence. "That will be the first place we meet with their ships." "Understood," Aaliyah said. "Prepare for all contingencies. We're not sure what we'll be walking into, but we need to show them that we're capable of contributing to their future, not just relying on their technology." As the officers filed out to prepare the ship for the upcoming meeting, Aaliyah remained by the window, her mind whirling with possibilities. She had made a decision to join with Hion, to offer her knowledge and experience. But the reality of what lay ahead was daunting. She was leading her people into an unknown future, and there was no way to predict what the galaxy had in store for them. She thought back to the conversation with James Tenon, the administrator of Hion. He had said that humanity's future depended on their cooperation. But what if they were wrong? What if Mount Greylock wasn't meant to be a part of this new future, a future where their people were no longer the pioneers? "Greylock," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Do you think we're making the right choice? There was a long pause before the AI responded. I believe that every decision we make from this point forward will shape the future. But there is no certainty in the unknown, Aaliyah. You've always known that. Aaliyah's fingers brushed the edge of the control panel, the cold metal grounding her in the present moment. She had always known the risks of space travel, had always known that the future was uncertain. But now, for the first time, it felt as if the future was slipping out of her control. Hion's ships were on their way, and soon everything would change. But the question still remained. Would they truly find a place in this new galaxy? Or would they be lost to the annals of history, nothing more than a footnote in the grand story of humanity? She took one last deep breath and turned to face the future. Facing the unknown, Aaliyah stood at the front of the command deck, watching the swirling expanse of stars through the massive observation windows. In just a few hours, their ship would meet Hion's fleet, the ships of the future, ships that had been designed to explore the farthest reaches of the galaxy, ships that had surpassed everything Mount Greylock had been capable of. Aaliyah couldn't shake the feeling of impending change, of stepping into a new world where her place was uncertain. But no matter how uncertain it was, she couldn't turn back. Her people, the colonists who had been in hibernation for centuries, still had no idea what they were about to wake up to. They were about to find out that the world they had hoped to create no longer existed, that their future was already written by a new humanity, one that had evolved without them. It was both exhilarating and terrifying to realize that they were about to play a role in that future. But what role? And how would they fit into a galaxy that had moved on so far without them? Greylock, Aaliyah said, her voice steady. What's the status on Hion's ships? Greylock's voice filled the room almost immediately. Hion's ships are on course. They will arrive in approximately 1 hour. We are within range of their communication systems. They are preparing to initiate contact. Aaliyah took a deep breath. This was it. The moment she had been preparing for her entire life. The moment when everything changed. She had always dreamed of being a leader, of guiding her people to a new world. But now she was tasked with something far more complex, guiding humanity's future in a galaxy that no longer needed them in the same way. What's our plan? Aaliyah asked, turning to her officers who were gathered around the table, waiting for her instructions. We prepare for the meeting as planned, one of the officers responded. We ensure our communication systems are ready, and we establish a neutral tone. We can't afford to make any mistakes with them. Their technology is far beyond ours, and they've already made it clear they want our help, but they won't do so unless they feel we have something valuable to offer. Aaliyah nodded, her eyes flicking from officer to officer. Their faces were a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. They were in uncharted territory, just like her. And no matter how well they had prepared, there were still too many unknowns. They had no idea how the Hion fleet would react when they saw Mount Greylock, a relic of the past, entering their system. Would they treat them as allies, or would they see them as obsolete, irrelevant, and best left forgotten? The door to the command deck slid open, and a new officer entered. He had been assigned to the team recently, and wasn't fully aware of the situation's gravity. His eyes widened as he saw the tense expressions on everyone's faces. What's going on? He asked cautiously. We're about to make contact with Hion's fleet, Aaliyah said, her voice calm but firm. They've asked for our help, and now we have to decide what kind of future we're going to make with them. But it won't be easy. The officer nodded, understanding the weight of her words. Right. So we're not just meeting a colony. We're meeting a completely different version of humanity. Exactly, Aaliyah said. And we have to make sure they understand that we still have something to offer. We may be behind in technology, but we have experience they don't. As she looked at her officers, Aaliyah could see the determination in their eyes. They might be facing a future they hadn't expected, but they weren't going to back down. They had a role to play. They had knowledge and wisdom that could contribute to this new humanity, and they were going to make sure their voices were heard. Minutes passed, and the tension in the air thickened. Aaliyah walked over to the communication console, where the connection to Hion's fleet was being established. Her heart pounded in her chest as she saw the message flicker onto the screen. It was from James Tenon. He appeared on the screen, his face serious but welcoming. "Co-Captain Aaliyah," he said, his tone respectful. "I'm glad we're able to speak again. As we discussed earlier, Hion is ready to offer you a place among us. But before we move forward, we need to hear your terms. We need to understand how Mount Greylock can help us, and what role you envision for your people in the new future we are creating." Aaliyah stood tall, her voice steady as she spoke. "James, we've come a long way to meet you. Our people have lived in hibernation for centuries, and we have woken to a world that has moved on without us. But we are not relics of the past. We have experience, knowledge, and skills that can contribute to your future. We are ready to work with you to build something that lasts." James nodded thoughtfully. "We've studied your mission, Aaliyah. We know that you've faced the difficulties of long-term colonization, terraforming, resource management. We need that expertise, but we also need to understand how your people can adapt to a world where technology is no longer the limiting factor. We need your experience to guide us, but we also need you to evolve with us." Aaliyah felt a pang in her chest. They were asking her to do what she had never expected, to adapt, to embrace the future, not as pioneers, but as partners. It was humbling, and it was terrifying. But it was also an opportunity to shape the future of humanity in a way that had never been possible before. "We're ready to adapt," Aaliyah said, her voice filled with conviction. "We will help you, and together we will build a future that lasts, not just for us, but for everyone who comes after us." James' expression softened. "I believe in that future, and together we'll create it." The transmission ended, and the room fell into a heavy silence. Aaliyah stood in the center of the command deck, her heart still racing, but a sense of resolve settling over her. They had made their decision. The people of Mount Greylock weren't just survivors. They were contributors to a future that humanity had never imagined. And in that moment, Aaliyah realized that the future, while uncertain, was theirs to shape. The past was gone, but the future was wide open, filled with endless possibilities. It wasn't the future she had expected, but it was a future that she was ready to face, alongside her people and alongside Hion. Humanity's story was no longer one of isolation and survival. It was one of cooperation, of growth, and of building something greater than any one person, any one ship, or any one colony could ever achieve alone. And that was a future worth fighting for.